This is a webinar on Dynamicweb in Azure, and we had some requests and some support cases in the past year or so. So I'm going to talk a bit about this. Dynamicweb has been able to host in Azure since version 8.3, where we changed the Dynamicweb application to support that. So I'll go through some of the most common thing related to Azure hosting. So the agenda for today is first a very short introduction to Azure in relation to hosting at Dynamicweb, a bit about how we can choose an Azure hosting platform. There are different options out there, pros and cons of those, how to install Dynamicweb in Azure, a bit about debugging in Azure, which is a point I think I've skipped. Now I remember error in the agenda. Then we have something about support in Dynamicweb, of Dynamicweb in an Azure hosting environment, and in the end, just a small comparison between Azure and Dynamicweb Cloud and some of the things that you should be aware of in relation to hosting in there. And it's a small webinar. We have only 8 attendees, so you can just write in the question pane if you have questions, or I can hand over the microphone, so you're welcome to talk or ask questions as we do. So first of all, a short introduction to some of the things we have. Azure itself is 170 or 80 different smaller services that you can hook up to and buy through the Azure portal. And a lot of them is unrelated to Dynamicweb directly. Of course, they can be used. And it can be things like speak recognition or recommendation engines or all kinds of smaller footprint services. What we need to run a Dynamicweb is, of course, a web server, and we need an SQL server. And for the web server, we basically in Azure have 2 ways of hosting a Dynamicweb, and one of them is using the Azure Web Services, also known as a web app, and the other way is hosting on an Azure VM, which is basically the same as a dedicated server as you would get it in any other hosting environment. And whereas the Azure Web Service is more like a web hotel, but it's also a bit different since it can be an isolated instance, and it can scale quite a bit compared to regular web hotels where you usually have a specific amount of resources available. And the way to install and do all the things on these 2 platforms are very different. The Azure Web Service is the one we're going to focus on today, whereas the Azure VM is like installing a Dynamicweb as in any other hosting environment, and can be taken a look at as at a dedicated server. Azure VMs comes in a lot of different, and Azure Web Apps comes in a lot of different tiers or configurations, and I'm going to cover some of those. So the web app, basically, we have 3 different instances that are relevant for hosting a Dynamicweb. We have S instances and P instances and I instances. And S means standard, which is the low level and the lowest starting point that you can get in the Azure hosting tiers to run a website in production mode. And P instances, they are a little bit bigger, and they basically have more computing power, faster processors, and mostly important, they have SSD disks, meaning that I/O on these instances is much higher than the ones that we have on the S instances. And we'll get back to that. Why that can be important, because we have disk-intensive operations with the Dynamicweb. So when we index products, or when we are logging to disk, or reading and writing templates and images and resizing images and so on, Dynamicweb uses relatively high amounts of disk and I/O, which is why it's important to take that into consideration. So S instances come in different sizes, called S1 for the smaller one, and then you have S2 and S3, which is bigger ones, and the pricing is around 65 euros just for the website. We need a SQL database, coming back to that later on. And the 65 euro version, or the S1, is not suitable for an e-commerce solution or anything like that, because we don't have enough computing and memory power on that one. S2 and free could be considered for smaller e-commerce sites without too much load, and if you only do an indexation once a day and stuff like that, this is also a suitable one. Once you hit a little bit of size in your website, you need at least a P1 instance, which starts at 120 euros. It basically is the same as an S1, except we have a little more, we have double the amount of RAM available, and we have much more IO available. So I would go for P instances if you have a medium-sized e-commerce and up, or just above a small one. The last option is the I instance. I didn't include it here, but that is if you have a mission-critical website, you should choose an I instance, which is a dedicated resource. So you basically have your own dedicated virtual machine underneath it, but you operate it like an Azure web app instance. And of course, you get much more performance out of an I instance than you do of the other two. The last option is the VMs, which I'm not going to go into details. There's so many different ways to configure an Azure VM. You can focus on a lot of CPU or a lot of RAM or a lot of IO and combinations of that. So basically, you need to take a look at how often you put data in and out of your Dynamicweb and how much you integrate and index and stuff like that. And you probably need to be, you definitely need something with a fast IO, choosing something with SSD disks. And you also need some memory, relatively high amounts of memory in these Azure VMs when choosing one of those. But there's so many different types. So, and I'm not going to cover those from now on in this presentation. Then you have the web server itself, and Dynamicweb also has a database, and for that we use SQL Server, and that's basically Azure SQL Server, and it comes in a wide variety of hosting options as well. You can host a dedicated SQL server, or you can have some scaling tiers. I'm just looking at a single database hosting tier in this one, and inside this hosting tier, there's two different ways you can choose your instance. You can choose what is called DTU, and you can choose something called vCore, which is virtual cores. And the DTU versions is DTU means database transaction units. And these instances, you don't know the fixed or the price of these, because what you pay for is how many database transaction units you put through the SQL server. And it would automatically scale down and up depending on the workload on your database. But it will also do that with a small delay. So if you have certain peaks and so on, that's probably not the best option as well for running a Dynamicweb installation. And these database transaction units, they are computed depending on how much CPU, RAM, and how much IO you use on these ones. I'm not a big fan of this hosting platform for websites when they get better. Then we have the vCore option, which is my recommendation for e-commerce sites, especially if you get up to above the level of smaller e-commerce. I would choose a vCore. And it basically scales from 2 cores up to, I think, 30 cores or something like that. So you can get a really, really big SQL server on that one. And that makes it possible to really scale. And you can take one day where you scale it up to 30 cores if you're running on Black Friday and stuff like that. It doesn't auto scale the same way as the DTU version, as far as I know. But you can set up some rules to change the tier of this one. So that would be my recommendation for a running e-commerce solution. Dynamicweb in Azure, it's relatively simple to do. The installation requires a number of steps, which is covered in our installation guides. I'll just switch to this one. So, but basically what I want to do is going through Azure and create some resource groups and a database. And then we either create a database, an empty one, and let Dynamicweb create the database when we run the installation of Dynamicweb from the backend, or we can deploy an existing database from our computers into the web server. And once we've done that, we need to create the website itself, which is adding an app service and create it and give it a name and configure it on online. And you need to set it up to what version of .NET we are running and the platform and some other things in this one. It's relatively simple to do. And once you've done that, you get a link and something to run, and you get an FTP server where you can deploy all your files to that would be templates and images and so on onto to this production server, like you can do in any other web hotel. And then we need to configure the solution to run on the database and host it in Azure, and then you're basically ready to go. And I can just show you here in Azure how it looks like. I've created a website where I have the SQL database, and I have my web app in here along with all my other resources. So, and you can control all the things from up here and set it up depending on all the things that you need to do. This is pure Azure configuration. I'm not going to go into that. You can read the manual if you want to go into more details. But basically, I have the SQL and the web app instance as part of that. The last thing you need to be aware of is that the scheduled tasks works a bit different in Azure than they do on a regular hosted Dynamicweb. So you need to set up one of these what are they called? A Azure Logic app that is basically something that executes a query at every 5 minutes or whatever you want to do. And what it does, it executes the tasks that we have in the scheduled task in Manager and Dynamicweb. So all the things that are a little bit different in Azure is, of course, the database, because it's hosted on an Azure SQL server. We have the website. Files is the same thing, but file system is a bit different on Azure than it is on a regular Dynamicweb. But you access it using FTP or your File Explorer on Windows. Can't remember the protocol. And then we have some other things that needs to be taken into consideration. First of all, we have emails in Dynamicweb, because Dynamicweb will use a drop folder on the web server to put all the mails into that one. And then the IRS will take care of emails and send them off after they've been dumped to disk. But this is not possible in Azure, so Azure needs to be configured differently. So let's just take a look at, I have my Dynamicweb installation here in Azure. You can see it's called Rapido QA Azure Websites. And one of the things that needs to be configured is the SMTP section in here that needs to be changed to accommodate that we do not have access to the drop folders that it runs on the Azure web app. And we wait. And wait a little more. I'm using a free tier here, so it might not be the fastest in the world. I can also switch to a local version here. No, there you go. You can actually see this one has not been configured yet, so I need to configure it to the mail server that I have available from somewhere, and then I need to mark the do not use the SMTP pickup directory. Otherwise, if I don't set this one, I will get a lot of exceptions when we're trying to send an email. First, we'll try to put it in the pickup directory, and that will fail, of course, because it's not available on Azure, and then we'll fall back and send it to the SMTP server specified. Whoosh. So then we have Dynamicweb is logging a lot of things, and we are running import and export, and we have Lucene running on the disk. And these are just things to be aware of as part of this, because all of these three things, they are IO extensive. So depending on how much logging is enabled and how many log files you have, and how much import and export and how often you run it, and the same how often you index with Lucene, you should ensure you have a hosting plan, as I discussed up here, with sufficient I/O available. Don't choose a lower tier hosting, because these things will have an impact on the performance that you get out of your Azure web app. Also, Lucene is known to have sometimes some problems with disk operations with some of the files locking on Azure, and that's usually has something to do with slow I/O on the Azure web apps. We've changed this by adding a lot of timeout on Azure web apps for getting access to the Lucene logs. So, but still, it can be an issue, so don't be too cheap on I/O on this one. And the email marketing, as I just talked about, email, yeah, Azure has no drop folder. That means also when we send a lot of emails in email marketing, what Dynamicweb usually do is it takes 10,000 emails, for example, and write them to disk. And that is pretty fast. There would usually be 500 to 1,000 emails a second that we write to disk. And then the web server will take care of the emails one by one and send them out using the smart host feature on the website. That is something that we set up in the hosting environment in Host Nordic and with Dynamicweb Cloud. So, but in Azure, since the drop folder is not there, we need an external resource to send out the emails. That means SendGrid needs to be configured, or some other provider for the email marketing if you're sending out a lot of emails. Otherwise, you will run into very slow delivery of emails. Anyways, even though you're using SendGrid, it will take longer to send. If you don't use SendGrid, but just a regular SMTP, it will be very slow. So you will not be able to send out a lot of email marketings out of this. So I will just show you briefly what to do. So we have an email marketing. We have these delivery providers available that needs to be configured and set up to be used in email marketing. There we go. And we can create a new one and use SendGrid and need to configure it like this. And in email marketing, you can configure your folders to use these send providers here up on folder level. Configure it to use the SendGrid or whatever provider you choose to add into your solution. Oh, slow today. Yeah. So you can set that up here on the delivery provider. You will choose and create and choose the SendGrid provider in here to enable some performance gains on sending out email. Supporting Dynamicweb in Azure. Azure is basically an externally hosted solution. We have some things in our license term related to this, which basically means that the support is not Dynamicweb anymore. It's your partner that you choose to consider run the Azure website. And basically, we don't have we're not trained for this in our support domain department because we are not Azure certified yet, at least, and we don't have any experience running larger production scale websites in Azure. Of course, we run some of them in here for testing purposes and so on, but we don't have full scale experience with running these things. So you need to hook up with a partner that is certified as at least, and that's one thing, but they also need to have a bit of experience with Azure, because there's a lot of things related to debugging and operations and finding out what performance bottlenecks are, and also what are the common pitfalls in Azure hosting and so on, that requires a bit of knowledge and a bit of experience, and that is something we do not have in our support department. And basically, since this is not hosted by us, this is something you need to take care of as part of the service you sell to your customers, that you need some way or another, all these hosting things can happen. Comparing the Azure versus Dynamicweb Cloud, things like debugging, and that can be errors or performance or things not working, is on the partner. And either you as a Dynamicweb partner or your hosting partner that is handling the Azure itself Whereas in Dynamicweb Cloud, of course, our support department will take care of that, and our development department have full access to the hosting environment, so we can do the debugging and performance troubleshooting and stuff like that in our house. Then we have the monitoring tool that is part of the Dynamicweb offering. If you're hosting in Azure, this one that will take a look at all the things that goes wrong and so on, which is the event viewers and reporting and notification and so on that you can set up to monitor what's going on Dynamicweb. That is, of course, part of the Dynamicweb Cloud hosting, but it's not part of the Azure hosting as well. So, and if you run into problems with backup and restore, of course, it's you, the partner, or your hosting partner that will take care of that, whereas in cloud, we will do that. Upgrades from one Dynamicweb to another one, we deploy them to the servers at least, so they're available from the backend. Here you need to copy the files into Azure or make a rollover on a new instance and take care of that process. SMTP, it's included in Dynamicweb Cloud as part of the offering, and also using drop folders and so on. Here you need to use the external service, and the same for email marketing. We support this drop folder. And one smaller last thing is that HTTP2 and push promises is not supported on Azure. HTTP2 is, but not push promises. And it's also part of the hosting in Dynamicweb Cloud. Apart from this, of course, Azure also has some things to offer that Dynamicweb Cloud does not have. For example, it's possible to scale automatically, and you can also scale out. So you add more instances we have Black Friday coming up, and that would be one of the situations where Azure has something to offer that Dynamicweb Cloud does not. We can only scale up, adding more things, and Azure can do some other things. You can also distribute the SQL database in different regions at a cost, of course, in Azure, and of course, Dynamicweb Cloud does not support stuff like that. So that's basically it for now. And speaking of Black Friday and Halloween, not least, that's all for me today. I don't know if anyone has any questions or any comments. Now is the time to ask. Does scaling out requires extra configuration? Yes, it does. I guess you are talking about if it's requires configuration in Azure. It does, and probably you also need to deploy Dynamicweb as an NLB instance, because you would basically have more instances running at the same time, and you need to ensure that caching and so on is distributed if you're required to do that. You might be able to scale out and just live with caching not being up to date if you don't do a lot of work. As right now, you can do it without configuring that. Scaling up is basically just adding more CPU and more memory and so on, and that is part of the license. If you need to scale out, meaning you're running on multiple instances, that would require an NLB version of Dynamicweb, which is also requires a specific license for that.